The card was cream-colored and edged in a plain gilt line, and it had been placed, by a hand that would afterwards deny having placed it, at the seat to the right of the head of the table. The name written upon it in a copperplate hand was Miss Harriet Ainsley, and there was, in all of the county of Renmarsh, precisely one Miss Harriet Ainsley, and she was not the young woman for whom the card had been meant. The seat to which the card belonged was the seat kept, at Marlbrook House, for whichever lady the Duke of Elverton had chosen to distinguish, and the Duke had, that autumn, distinguished no one. So the card sat where it had been laid, and the footman who laid it did not look at it twice. And the housekeeper who checked the room did not look at it at all, and the small mistake that would rearrange 4 lives went to its place in the ordinary silence in which small mistakes usually go. It is a thing worth saying at the outset that most of what changes a life is done by a hand that does not know it is doing it, and by a person who has already left the room. You may look for lightning, and you may listen for trumpets, but the door of your life is oftener opened by a clerk with a pen. The house of Marlbrook stood on a shoulder of chalk above the river, and it had stood there long enough to have forgotten why. Its west wing had been built for a bride who had died before she saw it. Its east wing had been added for a son who had preferred London. Its gardens had been planted by a mother who had not lived to gather the fruit. Great houses, when they are truly old, become in the end a kind of ledger of unfinished business, and the servants who keep them as one keeps accounts, knowing which entries do not balance, and hoping that no one will ask. That evening a dinner of 24 covers had been ordered in the long dining room, in honor of the return of the Duke from a year in the northern estates, and every family within riding distance who had a daughter of marriageable age had sent one, and every family who had a son had sent him also, for it was understood by all that his Grace, being now 36, and being now the last of his line, must at last make his choice. The invitations had been drawn up by the steward, a mild man named Corbin, who had served the house for 31 years, and the cards for the table had been written by a girl in the housekeeper's room whose penmanship was admired. Between the invitation and the card, somewhere in the ordinary machinery of the house, a name had slipped a place, and it is with that slip that our story properly begins. Meanwhile, in a stone cottage at the low end of the village of Fen Ashcombe, 4 miles from Marlbrook by the river road, a young woman was mending the sleeve of her only respectable gown. She sat by the window because the candle was dear and the light was still good. Her needle went in and out and in, and the stitches were small and even, for she had been taught to sew by a mother who had believed that neatness was a kind of prayer. Her name was Alice Merryweather, and she was 23, and she had been, until a year before, the daughter of a country attorney of small means and honest reputation, and she was now the ward of an aunt who had received her without warmth, and kept her without waste. Her father had died in the spring, and his practice had died with him, and his debts, which had been the debts of a fair man in a hard trade, had eaten the little he had left, and she had come to the aunt with a black gown and a wooden box, and a habit of telling the truth that the aunt considered a great inconvenience. It was to this aunt that a card had arrived 3 days before, requesting the presence of Miss A. Merryweather at a dinner at Marlbrook House. There was in the parish also a Miss Amelia Merryweather, the aunt's own daughter, 17 and rose-cheeked and much in the way of being seen, and the aunt had opened the card and read it twice, and understood, without troubling to inquire, that the initial belonged to her Amelia. That the card had been drawn up in fact for Alice, placed in the invitation book by the steward Corbin who had known her father, and set down for the humble seat kept always at the foot of the table for a guest of no account, that some old kindness of the house might be quietly done, the aunt did not know and would not have believed. So Amelia was to go, and Alice was to sit at home, and Alice sat now by the window mending, because Amelia would presently need the shawl, and because the sleeve of her own gown had a small tear at the shoulder that had shamed her for a week. She mended, and she did not weep, for she had learned, in the year since her father's coffin was lowered, that tears were a currency the poor could not afford, and she thought, as she sewed, of the small graveyard where he lay, and of the promise she had made him on his last night, which was that she would keep her word in every dealing, though no one asked her word. It is by such promises, kept in the dark, that the truly formidable characters of this world are made, and though no one at Marlbrook House knew Alice Merryweather's name, and though she did not know theirs, everything that came after began in the quiet of that window, with a needle going in and out. Now the Duke of Elverton, whose given name was Nicholas Ravenshaw, and whose title had come to him at 19 with the suddenness of a slammed door, was at that hour riding home along the river road from the estates in the north. He had been away a year, which was 3 months longer than he had intended, and he had made the extra 3 months for a reason he would not have admitted even to his old tutor, Mr. Standish, which was that he had wished to postpone the dinner that awaited him, and the choice it was to force. He rode alone, ahead of his valet, because he liked the sound of the river at that hour, and because he was tired of company. He was a tall man, spare rather than broad, dark of hair and gray of eye, and he wore his rank as men wear a coat that fits, without display and without apology. He had been called cold since he was 20, and he had not troubled to correct the report, for the report kept a certain kind of person at a useful distance. What was not known in the county, and what will presently matter, was that his coldness was not the coldness of an empty room, but the coldness of a room whose fire has been put out, and whose door has been shut, and that a fire, once put out, may be relayed, and it may burn again, only. It must be relayed by hands that do not know they are relaying it. 15 years before, when he was still young enough to be foolish and had not yet been given reason not to be, he had loved a girl named Isabel Carr, who had been a governess in a neighboring house, and who had died in the outbreak of fever that had also taken his father. He had been 6 weeks a duke when he stood at her grave, and he had understood then, with the clarity that grief sometimes lends, that a man of his rank was not permitted his heart, but only his duty, and he had folded up the one and set about the other, and he had done it so thoroughly that even he had almost forgotten where he had put the folded thing away. Only, forgetting is a kind of remembering, and duty is a poor housekeeper for the heart, and he would come home that night, though he did not yet know it, to the reopening of the door he had shut. So the three of them, without knowing of one another, rode and mended and rode toward the same table, the card that had been misplaced, the girl who did not know she had been named, and the man who had learned not to hope. And the house of Marlbrook, which had been standing 300 years, and had seen every kind of arrival and every kind of departure, prepared its lamps and its silver, and knew nothing, as houses know nothing, of the hour that was almost upon it. To understand the price of what followed, you must first understand the debt that was already owed. The parish of Fen Ashcombe held 2 families of the name of Merryweather, and it is not too much to say that the confusion of the two, and the willingness of the world to prefer the louder to the truer, was the whole shape of Alice's life. Her father, John Merryweather, had been the honest one, and his brother, the aunt's late husband, had been the other. The honest one had died poor, the other had died leaving a comfortable house and a habit of small dishonesties in his widow, who took to widowhood as some women take to religion, with a great deal of costume and very little conviction. It was into that house that Alice had come, with her wooden box and her black gown and her promise, and it was in that house that her aunt, Mrs. Hester Merriweather, had begun at once, with the placid cruelty of a bookkeeper adjusting a column to reduce her. The reductions were small and steady. There was the removal of Alice's name from the pew plate at church, so that Amelia might sit in the family place, and the reassignment of her father's book of prayers to a shelf too high to reach, and the substitution of an older, plainer gown for the mourning her father had bought her the winter before he died, and the polite explanation offered to any visitor who asked that dear Alice was so quiet and so bookish and so plainly not fond of society, that they had ceased to press her upon it. Each reduction was accompanied by a smiling apology. Each was, in its own accountable way, a theft. And Alice, who had been taught by her father that a fair witness sees all sides, had watched the ledger of these thefts fill up with a kind of grim attention, and had said nothing, because to say anything was to invite the more elaborate cruelty of denial. What she did not know, and what Mr. Corbin the steward at Marlbrook did know, was that her father had once, 20 years before, done a small service for the old Duke of Elverton, a matter of a signature obtained without the fraud that would have voided it, and had refused any reward for it beyond a handshake, and had said, when pressed, that if ever his child stood in need, he would consider the debt paid by the house remembering her. It was a private undertaking, made between two grave men in a study, and the old Duke had recorded it in the household book with the peculiar reverence such men reserve for their own promises. When the news of John Merriweather's death had reached Marlbrook, Corbin had turned to that page and had drawn a small line under it, and had waited for his own master's return before doing anything more, and when the invitation list for the welcome dinner had been drawn up, he had, without troubling to explain himself to a soul, added Miss A. Merriweather to it, meaning the daughter of the man in his book, and meaning by it no more than that a decent seat should be found for her at the foot of the table, and a decent kindness done, and the old promise honored in the quiet manner in which such promises are best honored. He had not foreseen the girl in the housekeeper's room, who was new that season, and who copied the invitation names onto the place cards without looking at the seating plan, and who was interrupted, at the crucial moment, by a boy with a message about a broken pane in the conservatory, and who returned to her table and continued from where she thought she had left off, but was in fact one line above. So the card written Miss Harriet Ainsley, which should have gone to the seat of honor, was written on the wrong blank, and the card written Miss A. Merriweather, which should have gone to the foot, was written on the right of the head, and no one in all that great house saw what had been done. It is worth saying, before we go further, that in a properly moral tale we might have preferred a villain here, some enemy of Alice's who had contrived the mistake to embarrass her. But it was not so. The girl was a good girl, and the boy was a good boy, and the broken pane was a real broken pane, and Corbin was a fair man, and the Duke was a tired man, and the aunt was merely herself. Between them, without malice and without design, they arranged a hinge, and history, which is oftener the sum of clerical errors than of great intentions, turned upon it. The morning of the dinner, then, Mrs. Merriweather sat in the parlor with the card between her thumb and finger, and read the address twice and smiled, for she believed that at last her Amelia was to be shown. She rang for Alice, and Alice came and stood with her hands folded before her, as she had been taught to stand. "You have heard, of course," said the aunt, without looking up. "Marlbrook, the Duke, has come home. Amelia is to go. She will need the shawl. The blue is too showy. The gray will do. See that the sleeve is mended by 3. Alice inclined her head. Yes, Aunt and Alice. The aunt looked up now, and her small eyes fixed on the girl with the fond severity she reserved for her charities. You will oblige me by keeping to the still room this evening. Amelia will not wish to think of you standing at the window. It is not becoming to sit at a window and stare when a house is at business. Do you understand me? Perfectly, Aunt. Good girl. Good girl. The aunt returned to the card. The Duke, she said dreamily, 36, and unattached. It was said with the piety of a woman for whom money and rank were the true articles of faith. Alice went out. She went to the sewing room, and she took up the shawl, and she sat down, and she mended it, and it was of that shawl and of that sleeve that we spoke earlier, for the sleeve of her own gown had been mended in the same hour, out of the same thread, for a purpose she did not yet know she would have. She mended the shawl first, because the shawl was Amelia's, and she had been taught, by the man whose grave was under the yew, that a promise to work first for others was one of the small kindnesses that cost nothing and paid much. Then she mended her own sleeve, because a sleeve one wears in the still room ought also to be sound. There is a dignity in the still room, if one brings it with one. She sang very quietly an old song of the fens as she sewed, and if anyone had been listening, they would have heard that she sang a little flat, for she had been taught music by her father, and her father had had no ear. It was Corbin who came at 3. He came in his own person, which was, in that house, a small event, and the aunt, having heard the wheels, met him herself in the hall with a curtsy she had rehearsed. Mr. Corbin, from Marlbrook, you honor us. Madam, Corbin was a small, tidy, tired man who had spent 30 years apologizing for the ambitions of others and had none left of his own. He took off his hat, and he made his small bow, and he did not smile. I have come to convey the compliments of His Grace's household, and to say that a carriage will be sent at 6:30 for Miss Merryweather. A carriage, said the aunt, in a voice that had gone a little high. Sent for her. It is the practice of the house, said Corbin, without expression, for ladies dining at His Grace's table for the first time. The aunt's color rose. She had not expected the courtesy, and she took it, in the manner of her kind, as her due, but she took also, being not quite a fool, a small measure of alarm at the formality of it. At what seat? She asked. Is Miss Merryweather placed? Corbin looked at her a moment. He had a habit, when he was about to say something he did not wish to have to defend, of examining his glove. He examined his glove now. Miss A. Merryweather, he said, with the smallest emphasis on the initial, is placed at His Grace's right hand. The aunt made a sound. It was not a word. Corbin bowed again. 6:30, he said, and turned to go. At the door he stopped, and looked once toward the passage that led to the still room, and he had for an instant the odd feeling of a man who has sent a letter and cannot recall it. Then he set his hat upon his head and went out to his carriage, and told the driver to take the long way home. He did not know why he had told him so. We shall take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. Between 4 o'clock and 6 on that afternoon in the parlor of Fen Ashcombe, the aunt was a woman transformed, and the object of her transformation was Amelia. Amelia was washed, and Amelia was dressed, and Amelia was scolded, and Amelia was praised, and Amelia, who was a good-natured, silly, kind-hearted creature, much more fitted for a farmer's kitchen than a duke's table, submitted to all of it with the placid stupidity of a well-brushed pony. She wore the pink, she wore the pearls that were paste, she wore the shawl that Alice had mended, and she looked in the glass and said, faintly, "But, Mamma, why should he wish to place me at his right hand?" "Because," said the aunt, seizing her daughter's chin between finger and thumb, "he has heard of your beauty." because he has been told of your fortune, because these things do not happen by chance, because it is your night, my girl, and you will not spoil it by doubting." And Amelia, who was fond of her mother and had learned young to prefer easy answers to true ones, ceased to doubt. Alice, in the still room, heard the bell and heard the carriage and heard the door and heard the aunt's voice saying, "Go up, dearest, go up." And she went on making the currant cordial, for it was Wednesday, and Wednesday was cordial day. And one did not stop being fair to Wednesday, because the world had gone a little mad. She was still stirring when Amelia came, in the pink, to the still room door. "Alice," said Amelia in a small, guilty voice. "Cousin, I am to go. I know, I wish you joy of it." "Alice, do I look, will he?" Alice set down her spoon. She looked at Amelia, the round pretty face, the mother's ambition worn like a jewel too large for her ears, the honest fright behind the pink. She thought, briefly, of what she might have said had she been any other kind of woman, some tart small speech about the pearls, or the pink, or the seat at the right hand. She did not say it. She was not that kind of woman. "You look very well," she said. "Stand straight. Do not speak of your fortune. Say little. If a lady speaks to you, listen to her. If a gentleman speaks to you, look at his forehead, not at his eyes. It will steady you. And when the Duke speaks, if he does, remember that he is a man, and a tired one, and answer him as you would answer a tired man." Amelia stared. "How do you know?" "I do not know," said Alice. "But my father used to say it, and my father was often right." Amelia leaned forward, and, with the impulsive grace that was her only real inheritance, kissed her cousin on the cheek. Then she was gone in a flurry of pink, and the door shut, and Alice went back to her cordial. The carriage went, and the aunt went with it, though she had not been invited, for she meant to see her daughter set down at the great doors, and to be seen seeing her. And the still room was quiet, and the currants were red, and Alice was, for the first hour of that evening, at peace. She should have remained so. She would have, had it not been for Corbin's book, and for the coincidence, which was not in strict truth a coincidence, that the girl who had written the place cards had confessed her doubt to the housekeeper at 5. And the housekeeper had gone to Corbin at 5:30, and Corbin had gone to his book at 5:45, and had understood, with the sudden cold clarity of an honest man discovering an accident of his own making, that the wrong young woman was about to sit down at his master's right hand. There was, at that hour, no time to correct the seating. The rooms were opened, the fires were lit, the guests were arriving. Corbin stood at his desk with his hand on the book and did what an honest man does when a small mistake threatens to become a great injustice. He sent the fastest boy in the stables, on the fastest horse in the yard, back along the river road, with a note for Miss Alice Merriweather at Fen Ashcombe, and instructions to bring her in the second carriage whether she came in silk or in linen, and he wrote at the foot of the note, in a hand that trembled a little, the words, "Your father's name." It was, in its plain way, a summons and a promise. Alice was skimming cream when the boy came to the kitchen door. She read the note twice. She read it a third time, standing very still in her apron, and then she took off her apron, and she folded it, and she laid it on the deal table, and she said to the cook, who was staring at her, "I shall be back before midnight." "Miss," said the cook. "I shall be back before midnight," said Alice again, in the flat voice she kept for facts, and she went to her room. She had one gown that was fit, and it was the gown whose sleeve she had mended that morning. It was of black stuff, plainly cut, and it had been her father's Christmas gift to her, and it fitted well. She put it on. She dressed her hair without a maid, in the low knot she had worn since her mother had died. She fastened at her throat the thin silver locket that had been her father's last present to her, which held a snip of his gray hair and which she had never taken off. She put on her only pair of good boots. She looked once in the small glass over her washstand, and she did not look long, for vanity had been one of the household gods the aunt had never let her worship, and she went down. And she got into the carriage, and she said to the boy, "Drive on." It was a 5-mile ride at a good pace, and she made it with her hands folded in her lap and her mouth firm and her heart, though she would not have called it that, doing the thing hearts do at such times, which is to become perfectly still in the way a small animal in a great field becomes still when the shadow of a hawk passes over. She thought, as they went, of her father. She thought of his face on the last night, and of the way he had said, when the pain gave him leave to speak, "Alice, if ever there is a Marlbrook business, you go, and you carry my name in your mouth, and you do not be afraid of any man." She had not known then what he meant. She was beginning, in the swaying dark of the carriage, to guess. In the long dining room at Marlbrook House, 24 covers were laid, and 24 candles doubled themselves along the polished wood, and the guests were being brought in the order of precedence, and the room hummed with the smiling, quantifiable rudeness of country society at its best behavior. Amelia, in the pink, had been received in the drawing-room by the Duke's aunt, Lady Sophronia Ravenshaw, who was 78, and who had, at the age of 16, been proposed to by a prince of Bavaria, and who was, in consequence, not easily impressed. Lady Sophronia had looked at Amelia over her spectacles for perhaps 3 seconds, had put her spectacles down, had said, "Merryweather?" Merryweather, and, upon being told, had gone very quiet, and had turned to the housekeeper, and had said, in a voice that carried, "There is some error here." The housekeeper had turned red. Corbin, entering at that instant, had turned pale, but had steadied himself, and had bowed. "Madam, if your ladyship will trust me with 5 minutes, the error is on its way to being righted." Lady Sophronia had looked at Corbin, and Corbin had looked at Lady Sophronia, and between two people who had served the same house for half a century a great deal is said in a look. She turned to Amelia, and, with the courtesy that had kept the Prince of Bavaria in love with her for 40 years, took Amelia by the hand. "My dear," she said, "I have a fancy to sit beside you at dinner. You will indulge me. My nephew must do without either of us." Amelia, who had been afraid of the Duke and had not understood why, and who was afraid of Lady Sophronia and understood exactly why, curtsied with relief, and Lady Sophronia patted her hand and let her in. The Duke had, until that moment, been standing at the fire with his back to the room, waiting, in the way tired men wait, for something to be over. He turned when they came in. He greeted the guests he was obliged to greet, one after another, in the flat, correct voice he had made his instrument. He noted, without particular attention, that his aunt appeared to be leading in a large young woman in pink whom he did not know, and that his aunt had, from the doorway, cast at him a look he had known since he was 7 years old, which meant that he was to ask no questions and do as he was told. He asked no questions. He did as he was told. It was at that instant that the second carriage was heard upon the gravel, and it was at that instant that Corbin, standing behind the Duke's chair, said quietly, close to his master's ear, "Your Grace, there is a lady come whose name is on the seating. If your Grace will permit me to present her to your Grace, you may then do as you please." Her father was John Merryweather. The Duke turned his head slowly. "Merryweather," he said. "My father knew a Merryweather. Your Grace's father knew this lady's father," said Corbin, and made a promise to him. "If your Grace will trust me for the space of one course, I will explain all. "I will trust you for the space of one dinner," said the Duke after a pause. "Present her." Alice was brought in. She had come as one comes from a 5-mile drive at speed, a little pale, and her cheeks had the wind in them, and her hair had held. She was in her black gown, and the silver locket lay at her throat, and her hands, which were the hands of a girl who had scrubbed and stirred and sewn and skimmed and never troubled to hide it, were folded before her. She looked, in that room of jewels and silks and pastel pinks and imported ostrich feathers, as a plain wren looks in a room of parrots, and she looked, also, at second glance, more like herself than anyone else there looked like themselves, which is a quality that certain rooms recognize before certain men do. Corbin brought her forward. "Your Grace," he said, in the voice he had used for 30 years to announce the small and the great alike, Miss Alice Merryweather, of Fen Ashcombe. The Duke bowed. It was the small bow he made to all his guests. It was not a fraction deeper. His eyes, however, rested on her face a moment longer than they had rested on the previous 19 faces, because the face was not a face he had expected, and because the pallor of it and the steadiness of it were, in a woman of her apparent age, the kind of small thing his father had taught him to notice. Alice curtsied. It was a plain curtsy, done well, no more, no less. She did not smile. "Your Grace." "Miss Merryweather." He straightened. "You have come some way this evening." 4 miles, Your Grace. "And a little more." "In some haste." "I was sent for in haste," said Alice, evenly. "I was not asked why. I came because a gentleman I did not know wrote at the foot of a letter, 'Your father's name.'" Corbin, behind, closed his eyes for the briefest instant. The Duke's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the beginning of one, and it did not finish. "Then you will oblige me," said the Duke, "by taking the seat that is yours until the mistake, if there is one, is understood. Mr. Corbin will see to it after dinner." "I am at your Grace's pleasure," said Alice, and then, with the small candor that was her most inconvenient inheritance, "though I do not know what the seat that is mine may be." "It is the seat to my right," said the Duke. Alice did not blink. "Then I will sit in it," she said, "and try not to be ashamed to it. It is the manner in which a person answers such a sentence, when it comes upon them unprepared, that measures them." She answered it as one who had been taught by a father to speak the plain thing. Behind her, Lady Sophronia, who had heard, took a very quiet breath. The Duke offered his arm. He would have done so to any lady entitled to the seat. He did it now. Alice laid her hand on his sleeve, the black stuff of her mended sleeve against the black stuff of his coat, a small anonymity of cloth, and they went in together, and the room, which had been prepared to bow at the pink, bowed instead at the plain, and did not know precisely why. The dinner was long, as such dinners are, and it was, in the ordinary way, dull. Miss Ainslie, who ought to have been at the Duke's right hand, had been placed one seat below and had not noticed, being fully occupied in observing that she had not been placed higher, and Amelia, who was safe under Lady Sophronia's wing, was being fed small pieces of information about ambassadors' wives with the same steady patience with which a good gardener feeds a young apple tree its water. The Duke, to whom the whole of the room was accustomed to giving up its attention, ate his soup and spoke to his neighbors to the right and the left, and did his duty by the table. But it was noted afterwards by more than one person of unusual attentiveness, and there is always, at such tables, one such person, that the Duke turned oftener to his right than to his left, and that he did not turn to his right in the way in which a host turns to a lady of consequence, which is a turning of the head only, but in the way in which a man turns to a person who has said something he did not expect, which is a turning of the whole self. Between the soup and the fish, he had asked her about the road. Between the fish and the game, he had asked her about her father. Between the game and the sweet, he had ceased to ask her anything, and had instead begun to speak, and Alice, who had come prepared for interrogation and had steeled herself to it as to a cold bath, had discovered that what was required of her was, of all improbable things, to listen. What he told her, in the quiet, even voice he kept for facts, was that his father had once received a signature, obtained honestly, but at some private cost to the man who obtained it, from a country attorney who had refused all payment. That the attorney had asked, in place of payment, only that the house should, if the day came, remember his child. That the day had, evidently, come, that Corben, being an honest servant, had remembered. That he, the Duke, being a slow one, had almost failed to. "I did not know it," said Alice. "No," said the Duke. "Your father was a man who kept his transactions in his own head, and the debt of the house was not a thing for a child to be told. But you are not a child now, and a debt is a debt." "Your Grace," said Alice, carefully, "I did not come for a debt." "I know it," said the Duke. "That is why the debt is now larger." It was, for him, a longer speech than he had made to any woman since Isabel Carr, and he heard himself make it, and he was surprised. He looked at his glass, and he set it down, and he said, in a lower voice, "You did not seat yourself here. I did not. And you would rise, if I asked it." "At once." "I do not ask it," said the Duke. He did not ask it. Neither of them wanted her moved by the end. The dinner ended, as such dinners end, with the ladies withdrawing and the gentlemen sitting on. The ladies withdrew to the long drawing-room, where Lady Sophronia, having placed Amelia on a sofa with a plate of comfits and a young cousin to entertain her, walked the length of the room to Alice, who was standing by the window, looking at the dark of the park, and said, without preface, "Come and sit by me, Miss Merryweather." Alice came. Lady Sophronia was old, and she had seen more than any other person in the room, and she said, when they had sat down, "Your father was John Merryweather." "Yes, madam, and your aunt is Mrs. Hester Merryweather of Fen Ashcombe." "Yes, madam, and Miss Amelia is your cousin." "Yes, madam, and you were in the still room this afternoon." Alice was silent a moment. "Yes, madam," Lady Sophronia nodded. "Once I thought so," she said. She did not enlarge on the thought, and Alice did not ask. Instead, the old lady turned her sharp small eyes on the girl and said, in the plain voice that had reduced a prince of Bavaria to tears at 19, "My dear, my nephew is a good man and a cold one, and it is not necessary to warm him. He will warm himself, or not, in his own hour. What is necessary is that you be exactly what you are, and no more. Do you understand me?" "I understand you, madame." "Good." The old lady patted her hand. "Then we shall get on." It was a small speech, and it lasted no longer than 5 minutes, but it settled a good deal, and it earned Lady Sophronia, in Alice's private ledger, the first entry of a debt she would afterwards spend her life quietly repaying. In the dining-room, the gentlemen were drinking their wine, and the Duke, who was not much given to it, was drinking less than his share, and was addressing himself, with a courtesy that Corben would afterwards remember as the first sign, to the questions of an unpleasant neighbor named Sir Rowland Fetch, who had brought his own daughter that evening and had not obtained the seat for her he had expected. Sir Rowland was one of those men who conceal small resentments in large compliments, and he had had, all evening, the air of a bow held at a shallow angle. He said, now, over his glass, and with a smile, "A most surprising ornament to your table, Your Grace, the young person in black." The Duke did not raise his eyes from the fruit he was peeling. "Miss Merryweather," he said, mildly, "is the daughter of a gentleman my father esteemed." "Ah," said Sir Rowland, "a gentleman. Was he in trade, your grace, or in the law? In the law, said the Duke, and in poverty, at the end, said Sir Rowland, with a chuckle. These fen attorneys, they are like their own eels, slippery in life and cheap in death. It was said easily, in the confidential tone of a man who assumes that his rank permits him his wit. There was a small silence. The Duke set down his knife. He looked at Sir Rowland with the gray, steady eye that Corbin, standing at the door, knew of old. Sir Rowland, said the Duke, your grace, Miss Merryweather's father was John Merryweather of Fen Ashcombe. He was, in my father's judgment, one of 2 honest men in the county. He is now dead. His daughter is under this roof tonight because I owe him a debt. If you speak so of him again in my hearing, I shall consider it as spoken to me. The whole table had gone still. Sir Rowland's face went slowly the color of the wine. He opened his mouth and shut it and murmured a stiff apology and reached for his glass with a hand that shook a little. The Duke resumed the peeling of his fruit. Corbin, at the door, allowed himself, for the space of one breath, the small pleasure of a man who has watched an old promise honored before witnesses, and then went to see that the drawing-room was ready, and that the fire had been kept up, and that the pianoforte was open in case her Grace's aunt should command music. The next hour was, in the memory of most who were there, indistinguishable from the memory of 100 other such hours, but it was, in the private memory of 2 people, an hour of quiet consequence. When the gentleman came in, the Duke did not, as had been expected, walk to Miss Ainsley, whose father had been calculating on it. He walked to his aunt and stood a moment beside her sofa, and then he walked to the window where Alice had returned. He did not speak at once. He looked out at the park with her, and he said, at length, without turning, Miss Merryweather. Your Grace, I have not thanked you for coming. I was sent for. Yes, but you might not have come, and I might not have been the wiser. I know a little of Fen Ashcombe. I know something of your aunt. It was not, I think, an easy carriage to get into. It was the plainest carriage I have ever been in, said Alice, and the plainest journey. I only did not know, until I was told at the door, that I was expected. Whether I was expected on my own account or on my father's, I still do not know. On both, said the Duke, still without turning. There was a silence. She stood, and he stood, and the great window between them and the park was a black mirror in which 2 people, each with their hands quietly clasped, looked at each other without looking at each other. Miss Merryweather, said the Duke, at last, your Grace, I shall not keep you standing. But I have a request. If I send a carriage to Fen Ashcombe in 3 days' time, will you come, with your aunt if you must, and see my aunt? She has taken a fancy to you. Alice thought. She had learned, in her father's house, to answer nothing quickly. If your Grace's aunt sends for me, she said, I shall come. If your Grace sends for me, I shall not come. It was said quietly. He turned at last and looked at her, and it was the first time she had seen his eyes without the small barricade behind them, and she saw that he understood her, and that he was not offended. My aunt shall send for you, he said. That is well, said Alice. Miss Merryweather, he said once more, and paused, and then said gently, I did not sit you here, but I do not wish you moved. It was the closest thing to a declaration he had ever made to any woman since he was 21, and it was so far from a declaration, in the ordinary meaning of the word, that no one in the room, watching them, could have said what had passed. Alice inclined her head. Then I shall be seated, she said, until it is time to go. It was arranged an hour later that Alice should return in the Duke's carriage, and Amelia in the aunt's, and the aunt, who had returned to Marlbrook in her own person to fetch her daughter, had been kept in the housekeeper's parlor with a glass of ratafia by Lady Sophronia's careful order, and had not seen her niece at all. In the carriage, going home along the river road, Alice sat with her hands folded and her eyes open in the dark, and she said, to no one, in the flat voice she kept for facts, I do not know what is beginning. I know only that it began. Behind her, in the great house, the lamps were being put out one by one, and the Duke was standing by the fire in his own room, with the hearth tongs in his hand, laying, without knowing that he was doing it, the fresh sticks upon a fire that had been out for 15 years. And in Fen Ashcombe, the aunt was already in the parlor, composing the account she would give her sister of her daughter's triumph, and Amelia, in her pink, was falling asleep in the carriage with a comfit in her hand, and Alice, when she came in, would go quietly to the still room and put on her apron and skim the last of the cream, and would say to the cook, who was still awake, only, I am back before midnight. As I said, in the days that followed, the parish of Fen Ashcombe reorganized itself, as parishes will, around the news of the dinner at Marlbrook, and the news, as such news does, sorted itself first into the version that suited the aunt, and then, more slowly, into the version that was true. The aunt's version was that Amelia had been placed beside the Duke's own aunt, and had been much observed, and had won a great old lady's regard, and this was, so far as it went, no lie, and might have gone very far, had not the coachman of the Duke's second carriage stopped at the inn on his way home to water his horse and remarked, in the ordinary tone of a man delivering a fact, that he had brought Miss Merryweather in his own person from Fen Ashcombe, and had brought her, moreover, at his Grace's own order. From the inn the fact went to the smithy, and from the smithy to the church porch, and from the church porch to the aunt's parlor by way of the woman who came in on Thursdays to help with the linen, and by Friday the aunt understood that she had been made a small fool of by her own household, and by Saturday she had convinced herself that she had not, and by Sunday she was in her pew glaring at the back of Alice's head. Alice went on as she had gone on. She skimmed cream on Wednesdays and mended on Tuesdays and sat at the window and read her father's book of prayers, which she had, quietly, taken down from the high shelf and returned to her own room. When the invitation came from Lady Sophronia, in an old lady's crooked hand, it came addressed to Miss Alice Merryweather in words that permitted no confusion. Your presence is desired at 11 of the clock upon Wednesday next, in the drawing-room at Marlbrook, that Lady Sophronia Ravenshaw might make of you a small acquaintance. There was, this time, no possible mistake. The aunt, when the note was brought in, took it in the tips of her fingers and gave it to Alice with the smile she used for things she could not eat. You will not go alone, she said. Amelia shall go with you. Madam, said Alice, the note asks for me. Amelia, said the aunt, in a voice that had risen a little, shall go with you. Then, madam, said Alice gently, must write to Lady Sophronia, and ask her leave. It is not in my gift. The aunt stared. She had not, in her life, been checked by any person in her own house, and she was checked now, mildly, by a girl in a mended gown, and the check was so absolute that she could think of no answer to it. She wrote no note. Alice went alone. She went, on Wednesday, in the Duke's carriage. Lady Sophronia received her in the small drawing-room, and gave her tea in the manner in which one gives water to a plant one intends to keep, and asked her, in the course of an hour, 12 questions, all of them simple, and none of them stupid. Alice answered them plainly, and Lady Sophronia, when Alice had gone, sat a long moment with her hands folded, and then rang for Corbin. Corbin, she said. Madam, bring me my brother's book, the old book. Corbin brought it. Lady Sophronia opened it at the page he had marked 12 days before, and read the entry that the old Duke had made in his own hand, and closed the book, and looked at Corbin. "Tell his Grace," she said, "that I have found the debt in the book." "Yes, madam, and Corbin." "Madam? Send to Fen Ashcombe. I have a mind to see Mrs. Merryweather at close range. It is time." "Madam," said Corbin, "that will not be a pleasant hour." "I have not," said Lady Sophronia, "passed a pleasant hour since 1809. Do it." Between that Wednesday and the following month, the visits multiplied. Alice went, and Amelia was sent, and the aunt went, and the aunt was received with an old lady's courtesy that had in it the flat, cold politeness of a fair witness who intends, in her own time, to speak. It was in the third such visit that Lady Sophronia, in Alice's hearing, remarked to the aunt, without lifting her eyes from her embroidery, that she had heard Miss Alice was much used to the still room, and that the aunt would forgive her. But it seemed to her ladyship that Miss Alice was not, in the strict sense, a housemaid in her aunt's family, but a ward, and the daughter of a gentleman, and it was a curious economy that made a ward of 26 stand at a kettle. The aunt turned very red. Alice, who had never mentioned the still room to anyone in the great house, was silent, and for the first time in her adult life, had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep her face still. The aunt, that evening, forbade Alice the still room. It was a small victory. It was one of many. In the meantime, the Duke came and went. He was, in the strict sense of the country, not paying court to anyone. He made no formal call at Fen Ashcombe. He did not send flowers. He did not ride past the aunt's parlor window, as some men rode past parlor windows, in the hope of being seen not looking. What he did was to arrange, without announcement, that certain small kindnesses should be done. The pew plate at the church acquired, without ceremony, the name of Miss Alice Merryweather restored to it, and no one could say who had ordered the plate, or paid the mason. Her father's books, which had been sold at his death to a bookseller in Lincoln, appeared one by one on the small table in Alice's own room, sent up by a maid who had been given them by the housekeeper who had them, she said, from Mr. Corbin, who did not answer questions about them at all. A pair of good boots, plain and stout and exactly her size, appeared in a parcel with no note. And each of these things came into her life with the quietness of a hand replacing something that had been taken, and she understood, without being told, whose hand it was, and she did not thank him. Because to thank him would have been to make the kindnesses smaller than they were. Twice in that month, she saw him in person. Once at the church, where he read the lesson, and did not once look at her pew. Once at a small dinner at Marlbrook, to which the aunt was included by Lady Sophronia's grim insistence, and at which the Duke, having handed Alice in as a matter of pure justice, spoke with her exactly twice, once on the subject of a book of her father's, which he had also read, and once on the subject of the weather. It was noted, at that dinner, by an observant clergyman's wife, that Miss Alice Merryweather laughed once at some private turn of phrase of his Grace's, and that his Grace, when she laughed, looked at his plate, and that this exchange, which lasted the length of a single sentence, was the whole of what could be reported. But the clergyman's wife, when she went home that night, told her husband that it was a settled thing, and that they might as well have the surplice pressed. In such small ways, and in others we shall not weary to describe, the frozen thaw began. It began at Marlbrook, and it began in Fen Ashcombe, and it began, most importantly, in the Duke himself, who had, on the evening after the first dinner, gone into his own study and taken down a small locked box which had not been opened for 15 years, and had opened it, and had looked at its contents. A lock of dark hair, a folded letter, a plain ring, and had, after a long time, closed it again, and had said, aloud, to the empty room, in the flat voice he kept for facts, "I did not know I was still alive." It was a longer speech than he had made to himself in 10 years. It was witnessed by no one but the fire, and the fire, which had been lit that evening for the first time in the study since his return, was not talking. He kept the ring in his pocket after that, without knowing precisely why, and he took to walking, in the evenings, along the river road toward Fen Ashcombe. Without going the whole way, and he found, one evening, that his feet had carried him within sight of the aunt's chimney, and he turned back because he had promised himself that when he went it should not be by stealth. It was in the 4th week that the mystery, which had been quietly running under all of this like a river under a bridge, broke its bank. Corben came to his master's study one morning with a face the Duke had never seen upon him. "Your Grace." "Corben, I have this hour learned a thing about the estate that is not to be borne. If your Grace will give me 2 hours, I will lay the books before you, and you may judge." It emerged, in those 2 hours, and in the 3 days that followed of steady, cold, patient examination, that for 11 years the accounts of the Marlbrook home farm had been dressed by a hand which the Duke had trusted absolutely, that of one Ezekiel Pride, the under-steward, who had entered the house in the year of the old Duke's death, and who had, with a manner too smooth by half, and a set of small courtesies too well timed to be quite believable, made himself indispensable in the interval between a boy of 19 becoming a duke and a duke of 36 learning to be his own master. It was a betrayal of the ordinary kind, petty in each entry, colossal in the aggregate, a shilling here, a load of hay there, a false account of a repair, a sale of timber not credited to the estate. It was the shape of betrayal characteristic of a small, frightened man who had never dared a bold theft, but had every day dared the small one, because he had been sure that no one was watching. That it had been done under the eye of Corben, and under the eye of the Duke, and under the eye of the whole household, and had gone undetected, that was a matter that Corben took, for a full day, upon his own conscience, until the Duke, who was not a gentle man in such matters, but was a just one, sat him down and said, "Corben, you would have caught it if I had let you see the whole. I did not let you see the whole. The blame is between the man who did it and the man who did not choose to look. That is you and me, and it is not you first." Corben, who had wept once in his life, at the old Duke's funeral, wept a second time in that hour, quietly, and was permitted to. The Duke rose, when it was done, and said, "We shall not shame him publicly. We shall not put him in the dock. We shall let him leave the county with his life and no more, and every farthing shall be paid back over 10 years out of what he has, and if he lives to be old, he shall live to know why. That is my father's justice, and I hold to it." Corben bowed. "Your Grace." And Corben, "Sir?" "Say nothing of this at Fen Ashcombe. Miss Merriweather has troubles enough of her own, without our lending her ours." It was said with a plainness that told Corben, if he had not already known, precisely how the wind sat, and Corben, who had brought about the whole thing, in a manner of speaking, by the placing of a card, bowed once more and went out and shut the door, and stood a moment in the passage, and permitted himself the smallest, driest smile of the old servant who has seen his work honored before his eyes. And so the winter came. It came as it does in the fens, with a low mist that turned to a low rain, and then to a hard frost that locked the river and made the reeds ring. In Fen Ashcombe, the aunt, who had in the first days been furious, and in the second calculating, and in the third uneasy, had at last settled into the perpetual grievance of a woman who cannot admit that she has been outmaneuvered, and had begun to speak of Alice in the parish as a poor girl who had had her head turned by attentions she had never sought and would never repay. She said it kindly, over her tea, to the vicar's wife, and she said it more sharply, in her own parlor, to Amelia, who could not follow her, and she said it, with a small tremble in her voice, to Alice herself in the passage one night, having drunk a glass of ratafia more than was her wont. "You do not know," she said, catching Alice's wrist, "what he is. He is a proud man, and he is a cold man, and he has been in love once, and he is not the man to be in love twice. He will use you a winter, and set you down in the spring, and there will be no place for you then, my girl, and none of us will have you back. Do you hear?" Alice looked at the aunt's hand upon her wrist. She looked at the aunt's face. She saw, in it, something she had not seen there before, which was fear, and, seeing it, she was, for the first time, sorry for her. "I hear you, aunt," she said, gently. "I do not agree with you, but I hear you." The aunt let go her wrist. It was the last time in that house that they ever spoke sharply. The aunt, from that night, changed, not into a kinder woman, but into a quieter one, and Alice, without triumph, watched the change and understood, in some part, the price it was costing. It was that same week that Ezekiel Pride came to the aunt's parlor. He came late, and he came alone, and he came with the manner of a man who had been for a long time in the confidence of great people, and was now offering his confidence for hire. He would not, of course, have put it so, but Alice, who happened to be crossing the passage with a candle, heard through the door his low voice saying to the aunt, "Madam, it is against my will that I come. But there are things it is my duty to lay before you, in the character of a friend of the family." He was, that same night, dismissed from Marlbrook. He had come to the aunt because he had understood what wind was coming, and had thought to sell what he could before it came, and he had found in Mrs. Merryweather a woman ready to buy. What he had sold her was a story that the Duke of Elverton had, 15 years before, loved a governess who had died, that he had never recovered, that he was a man who took up with poor girls out of pity and set them down again out of pride, that Miss Alice Merryweather, in short, was being made a fool of, and that Mrs. Merryweather, being her only guardian, had it in her power to save her from the shame that must follow. He had said it, with tears in his eyes, over the aunt's little table. He had received, before he left, a promise from her that she would think of what he had said. And he had gone out into the night, and had ridden hard for the coast, and had never been seen again in the county of Renmarsh. And the story he had sold sat in the aunt's mind for a fortnight, growing riper each day, until it seemed to her not something she had bought, but something she had always known. It was upon the strength of it that she resolved, on a certain Thursday, to write a letter. The letter, which she wrote in the copperplate she reserved for great occasions, was addressed to the Duke of Elverton at Marlbrook House, and it was, in her own view, a masterpiece of dignified concern. In it she thanked his grace for the kindness he had shown to her niece, regretted, as a mother and as a Christian, to be obliged to speak plainly, feared that Alice, who had suffered a great grief in her father's death, had misunderstood the ordinary courtesy of a great man, and requested, in the interest of her niece's peace and of his grace's own reputation, that the visits and attentions cease. She sealed it with her best wax. She sent it by her own boy. She did not, before she sent it, show it to Alice. It was Corbin who received it. He read it, standing at his desk, with the still steadiness of a servant who has read many such letters in his time, and he took it to his master, and laid it before him, and said, "Your Grace, from Fen Ashcombe, I judge that you will wish to see it now, and to answer it later." The Duke read the letter. He read it a second time. He set it down. He did not speak for a full minute. Then he said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, "Corbin, have my horse saddled. I ride to Fen Ashcombe within the hour." "Sir." "Alone?" "Alone," Corbin hesitated. "Your Grace, may I say a word?" "Say it." "The letter is from the aunt. Miss Merriweather has not, I think, seen it. If your Grace goes to the house in anger, you may punish the wrong person." The Duke looked at Corbin. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You are right. Have the horse saddled. I will not ride in anger. I will ride to speak to Miss Merriweather in her own aunt's parlor, in the presence of her aunt. And I shall speak plainly, and once. Come with me, sir." It was a bright, cold January morning, and the ride was silent. The Duke rode ahead, and Corbin behind, and the frost was hard on the road, and the sky was of the pale, even blue that in the fens serves as the ceiling of grief. At the aunt's gate, the Duke dismounted and gave his horse to Corbin, and went up the path, and knocked. The aunt opened the door herself. She had been expecting, in the ordinary manner, a note in reply. She had not been expecting the man himself. She turned very white and then very red, and she stepped back, and she said, "Your Grace, this is. Pray come in." "I thank you," said the Duke, and went in. He asked to see Miss Alice Merriweather. Alice was called. She came, in her old black gown, from the passage where she had been dusting her father's books. She came, and stood in the doorway of the parlor, and looked at the Duke, and understood at once, in the way in which women who have been taught to read a room understand, that some blow had fallen, and that it had fallen from her aunt's side. The Duke stood by the parlor window. He bowed. "Miss Merriweather, your Grace. I have received this morning a letter from your aunt. It is a letter that concerns you. I do not think you have seen it. I do not choose to answer it in your absence. I have come to answer it in your presence and in your aunt's, so that neither you nor she may afterwards be misinformed as to what I have said. Do you consent to hear it?" Alice looked at her aunt. The aunt was standing by the fire, holding the back of a chair. She was not looking at Alice. "I consent," said Alice. "Your aunt writes," said the Duke, without heat, without haste, without any of the ornaments of anger, to request that I cease the visits and attentions that she believes I am paying to you. She writes as a mother and a Christian. She feels that you have misunderstood ordinary courtesy. She is concerned for your peace. She is concerned for my reputation." He paused. The aunt's face was, by now, quite gray. Alice's face had not moved. "I answer," said the Duke, "as follows. I do not pay you attentions of the kind your aunt describes. Whether I have been paying you a courtesy, or a debt, or a friendship, or something else, is a question I have not yet, in my own house, settled to my own satisfaction. Until I have settled it, I do not consider myself entitled to trouble you with it, and I have not troubled you. If, having settled it, I find that I have anything more to say to you, I shall say it to you first, and to your aunt second, and to no one at all before either of you. That is my answer to the letter. I have come to give it in your hearing, because I will not have you told second-hand that I have withdrawn, when I have not withdrawn, nor that I am pressing, when I have not pressed. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," said Alice. "Aunt," said the Duke, turning at last to Mrs. Merriweather with the courtesy of a man who has decided, on principle, not to be angry with her, "I shall not answer your letter in writing. I hold it answered. If you write me another letter of the same kind, I shall consider it as an insult to your niece, and I shall not receive it. If you do not, we shall continue as we were." The aunt made a small sound. She did not sit down. She only held the back of the chair a little tighter. "Miss Merriweather," said the Duke, turning back to Alice. "Your Grace, I have one further thing to say. It is not the thing I came to say. It has become the thing that I must say. I have been, this last month, coming slowly toward a question. I had thought to bring it to you in an easier hour and in a better manner. Your aunt's letter has made an easier hour impossible and a better manner unbecoming. I shall say it now, plainly, in her house, at the risk of her displeasure, and I ask you to answer me not now, but when you have thought." Alice's hands, folded before her, did not move. Her face did not move. Only the small pulse in her throat, above the silver locket, moved. "Miss Merriweather, my mother is dead, my father is dead, and my house is a cold one. I have believed, for 15 years, that it was to stay so. I do not now believe it. If, in a month, or in 6, or in a year, you find that you can bring yourself to be its mistress, and to be my wife, I ask it of you. I do not ask it because your father is owed a debt. I do not ask it because you were seated at my right hand by a mistake. I ask it because, since that mistake, I have not wished you moved. That is all. Take the time you need. Send your answer to me. Or bring it, or say it to Mr. Corbin at the door. It will reach me alike. Good day, madam. Good day, Miss Merriweather." He bowed once to the aunt, once to Alice, and went out. Corbin, at the gate, took his horse. They rode home. Not a word passed between them for a mile. Then Corbin, who had a right to it, said, "Your Grace, if I may, you may not," said the Duke, without heat. "Not yet." They rode on. In the parlor at Fen Ashcombe, when the door had shut, there was, at first, no sound but the fire, and then the aunt, still holding the back of her chair, said in a small, strange voice, "Alice, Aunt, did you know that he would come?" "No, Aunt. Did you know that he would say that? No, Aunt." The aunt sat down at last. Her mouth had gone a little slack. She looked at Alice and then at the letter she had written that morning, which lay upon the table where she had left the copy of it. "I am," said the aunt, in the same strange voice, "a foolish woman." Alice did not answer. It was not a thing to be answered. She only crossed the room and knelt down by her aunt's chair and took the aunt's hand in hers and held it a moment, and the aunt, who had not been touched by any human hand in tenderness in 15 years, wept. It was a small, silent weeping. It did not last long. When it was done, the aunt said, very low, "I have not been kind to you." "No, Aunt, I did not know how to be." "I know," said Alice. "Your uncle," said the aunt, and stopped and began again with a great effort. "Your uncle was not an honest man. Your father knew it. Your father would not say so, because your father was too fair a man to say so. But he knew it, and I knew that he knew it, and I have hated your father in my heart for 30 years for a knowing he never used against us. When he died, and you came, I could not see you, because I was still seeing him. That is all. That is the whole of it. I have nothing else to say. I do not ask you to forgive me. I have not deserved to be forgiven." It was, in its way, the longest speech the aunt had ever made in her life. Alice, who had been prepared for many kinds of scene but not for this one, laid her forehead a moment upon the back of the aunt's hand and said, without looking up, "You were kind enough. You gave me a house." "I gave you a still room," said the aunt. "It was a house," said Alice, gently. "It was your house, and you gave it. That is enough. That is all I shall ever remember of it." Between them, in that hour, there was made a kind of peace, not a great peace, but the small, tired peace of two women who have both been afraid of the same thing for different reasons and have laid the fear down at last on the same table. It would not make them into any different women than they were. It would only permit them to live, from that day, in the same house without wounding each other, and that, in this world, is more than most women of their kind ever achieve. Amelia, when she was told, that evening, of what had happened, said only, "Oh, Alice, I am glad. He has kind eyes." It was, from Amelia, a considered speech, and Alice, that night, in her own room, sat a long while at her window, with the silver locket in her hand, and looked out at the frost, and said nothing to anyone, not even to herself, for a long time. Then she lit a candle. Then she took paper. Then she wrote a note. It was short, it said, "Your Grace. I have thought, I have not needed the month. If your Grace will come to Fen Ashcombe again, at his own hour I will answer him in person. I do not choose to send an answer of this weight by a hand not my own. A. Merryweather." She sent it in the morning. Corbin brought it in at breakfast. The Duke read it once. He set it down. He said, "Corbin, my horse." And Corbin, who was tired, and who had earned an easier morning, said, "Your Grace." "Yes, sir," at once. "And if I may, yes, Corbin. I have been 31 years in this house. I know it. I should like to be here for the answer." "You shall be," said the Duke. He rode alone this time. It was a bright, still morning, and the frost on the reeds was breaking under a slow sun, and the river was moving again in patches under the ice. He tied his horse at the aunt's gate. He knocked. The aunt opened. She curtsied, the first true curtsy she had ever made in her life. She stepped aside without a word, and pointed, without a word, to the parlor, and closed the door behind him, and went, without a word, into the kitchen, and shut that door too. Alice was standing by the window. She turned as he came in. He did not sit. She did not sit. They stood, one on either side of the small rug her father had bought at a market in Boston 20 years before, and they looked at each other, and neither of them made any of the small nothing noises with which such moments are, in most parlors, filled. "Your Grace," said Alice, at length. "Nicholas," he said. It was the first time she had heard his given name spoken. It was the first time he had heard himself use it in her hearing. She heard it as one hears a door open in a house one has lived in for years without knowing there was a door there. She heard it, and she felt her eyes prickle, and she did not weep, for she was still Alice Merryweather. She only said quietly, "Nicholas, Alice." It was said gently, the way one lays a small bird on a table. There was a long silence. He said, "You will answer me. I will answer you. When you are ready. I am ready. But you must let me answer it in my own way. Answer it in your own way." Alice looked at him a moment more. Then she crossed the small rug, slowly, and stopped a pace from him. She raised her hand. She paused. She laid it, at last, upon the black cloth over his heart, the small hand of a girl who had skimmed cream and mended sleeves and buried her father with her own arms, and she said, in the plain voice she kept for facts, "Yes, if you will have me." Yes, it is a small thing, when it is said. It is the whole thing, when it is said. He put his own hand over hers on his coat, and he closed his eyes a moment, and he said, "Alice, I did not know I was still alive." "I know," she said. "I heard." "Heard what?" "I do not know." Something, in the way you did not ask. They stood so for a little while. It was not long. Nothing that mattered in that house that day was long. Then he said, "Come, your aunt is in the kitchen. She has been very civil to me at the door. Let us not leave her there." And Alice smiled, for the first time in his presence, and it was not the small polite smile of the drawing room, but a real smile, of the kind he had not seen upon any woman's face for 15 years. And he kept the memory of it ever afterwards, as a man keeps a coin he has been given by a stranger in a foreign country, whose worth he did not know at the time and only understood, on looking at it later, was the whole of his fortune. They went into the kitchen. The aunt was sitting at the table, with her hands folded on her apron. She stood when they came in. Alice said, simply, "Aunt, His Grace has done me the honor, and I have accepted him." The aunt looked at Alice. She looked at the Duke. She looked at Alice again. Then she said, with an effort that took the whole of what she had, "Your Grace, I wish you both very happy." And she meant it so far as she could mean anything of the kind. It was accepted as such. It was more than had been asked of her. There was no ceremony that day. There was no announcement. The Duke, after a quarter of an hour in the kitchen, during which he was given, without ceremony, a cup of the aunt's ratafia, which he drank without wincing, went back to Marlbrook, and Alice, that afternoon, sat down and wrote in her father's old book of prayers, on the flyleaf, the date, and beneath it, "This day, in my father's own house, and in his memory, I promised what I have to give." She wrote no more. She did not need to. The public parts of the business we shall not dwell upon. The banns were called. The aunt sat in her pew 3 Sundays running, and looked at neither the pulpit nor the porch, but somewhere between. Amelia wore the pink and cried into it at the third, calling out of pure good nature, and the marriage itself was made, on a plain morning in February, at the little church of Fen Ashcombe, with no more people in it than the parish and Lady Sophronia and Corbin, who wept quietly at the back, and the sexton who dropped the ring, and the vicar, who said the words with unusual attention, because he knew he would be asked about them by his wife for a fortnight. Alice wore her old black gown with the mended sleeve. She wore the silver locket. She wore, at Lady Sophronia's soft insistence, a small white shawl that had been the old lady's own mother's. She did not wear a veil, for she was of the opinion, which her father had shared, that a woman should be seen when she gives her word. The Duke wore, beneath his coat, the plain ring that had been in the locked box for 15 years, but he did not put it upon her hand. He put upon her hand, instead, a new plain gold band that he had ordered from the goldsmith at Lincoln with no stone in it, saying to the goldsmith, she would not wish it. And when she came out of the church and stood at the top of the little stone steps in the winter sunlight, with her hand in his, the parish looked at her and understood, in the ordinary way of parishes, that a plain fact had been settled and that the settlement was good. Now we must, as the old chroniclers do, tell what became of everyone, for a story that leaves its people scattered is like a house left with its doors open, and we have too much respect for our people to leave them so. Lady Sophronia Ravenshaw lived 4 years more. She died at 82, in the small drawing room, with Alice's hand in hers, saying with her last breath, "I am content, my dear. I have seen the house warm again." She was buried beside her brother, and her portrait was hung in the great hall opposite Alice's own, which had been painted, at Alice's protest, in her ordinary gown, and had been given, at Alice's insistence, a small darning bag at her feet, so that no woman coming into the house afterwards should be shamed by finery. Mr. Corbin lived 7 years more. He served to the end as steward. He trained up his own successor, a nephew of his. He stood godfather to the Duke's eldest son, whose name was John, for Alice's father, and whose middle name was Hester, for the aunt, which was Alice's own doing, and which the aunt, when she heard it, went out of the room to weep for. Corbin died at his desk, with his ledger open before him on a spring morning, and the Duke wept for him as for a father, and Alice for him as for a friend, and the household kept a small annual feast on the anniversary of his death, at Alice's order, and it is kept there still. Mrs. Hester Merriweather lived 9 years more. She was quieter in those 9 years than she had been in the 50 before. She came to Marlbrook once a month and was received by Alice with a courtesy that never asked her for more than she had to give, and she loved, in her way, the children who called her aunt, and when she died, in her own bed, in the little parlor at Fen Ashcombe, Alice sat by her the whole of the last night and held her hand, and the aunt, whose last words were spoken to Alice, said, "I did not know how to be kind, but you did. Remember that of me, my girl, if you remember anything." Alice remembered it and taught it to her children, and had it cut at her own expense upon the aunt's stone. She learned, at last, to be kind. It was more than the aunt had earned. It was what Alice chose to give. Amelia married, in her 20th year, a farmer of the parish, named Roger Halsted, who was 6 feet tall and slow of speech and honest as the day, and she was, in her own kitchen, extremely happy, and had 6 children, and taught the eldest of them to sing badly, in the family manner, and lived to be 80. She never lost her fondness for pink. She was often to be seen, in later years, at Marlbrook, with a basket of eggs on her arm, and one of her babies on her hip, and she and Alice, at the kitchen door, would take a cup of tea standing, in the manner of women who have not forgotten how they began. Ezekiel Pride, the false steward, was heard of 5 years later in Liverpool. And then, 3 years after that, in a small port in the American colonies, and then no more. His debts to the estate were paid back, farthing by farthing, out of the sale of his cottage and the small savings of a sister who took the burden upon herself with grim dignity, and who was afterwards, at Alice's private instance, sent every quarter a small pension by Corbin, which was continued after Corbin's death by his successor, and is continued to this day. He was never named in the family. He was pitied and prayed for, in Alice's own room, in the ordinary way, for she held, and taught her sons to hold, that the truest punishment of the false is to be pitied by the true, and that the man who has betrayed a house is, without any help from those he betrayed, already destroying himself. Sir Rowland Fetch, whose insult at the dinner had been the first stone laid in the wall of the Duke's plain love, lived to a great age, and quarrelled steadily with all his neighbours, and was buried in a large tomb by his own executors, and the Duchess, when the news came, said mildly, over her sewing, "Poor man, he was so afraid of being small," and went on with her stitching. The girl in the housekeeper's room, who had made the mistake with the cards, married the boy who had brought the message about the broken pane. They were kept in the household as long as they wished to be kept, and were, on the birth of their first child, given the small farm at Heatherfield to work, and they never knew, in all their lives, that they had, between them, married 2 other people. It was Alice's opinion that they should not be told. "Let them think," she said, once, to the Duke, "that they made a good marriage. They did. The rest is not their business." The Duke, whose grave grey eyes had learned to smile without his mouth, agreed. There is more that could be said, and shall not be, for a chronicle, like a garden, must be pruned. Only, of the Duke and Alice, we will say this. They had 4 children, and lost one, a little boy called Nicholas after his father, in his 3rd year, of a fever that could not be turned, and they buried him in the small graveyard where Alice's father lay, and Alice put on her old black gown, and the Duke wore, beneath his coat, the plain ring from the locked box, and they stood on either side of the small mound and said nothing. And it was Alice who said, at length, in the voice she had used to answer him in the parlor, "Yes, we shall bear it. We shall bear it." And they bore it. They did not pretend, ever afterwards, that they had not. It was Alice's rule, in the household, that on his birthday every year a small candle should be lit for him in the great hall, and no one should say why. And the children were told, when they were old enough, why, and the candle is lit at Marlbrook still. This, and other losses that must not be listed, formed the small residue of shadow which every honest happiness carries at its heels. It is well that it should. Some doors close and do not open again. Some hopes are folded and put away for good. Some prayers are answered with the reply that they had been the wrong prayers all along. That does not make the answered prayers less true. It only makes them heavier in the hand and more careful in the giving. So we come, as such tales must, to the last picture. Every year, on a certain day in autumn, being the anniversary of a dinner at which 24 covers were laid at Marlbrook, the Duke of Elverton and his Duchess dine. In the long dining room alone, there is no ceremony to it. There are 2 places set. There is a cream-colored card at the seat to the right of the head, on which the name Miss Alice Merriweather has been written afresh, in a copperplate hand, by the Duchess herself that morning. There is at the other place no card at all. His Grace, having grown up in the house, is thought to know where he sits. The children, when they were small, were permitted to watch from the door, and asked every year why their mother wrote her old name on a card, and their mother told them, every year, the same story, which they knew as well as she did, and the youngest, who had heard it 7 times, said, at last, because he asked who seated you beside him. "Yes, my dear," said the Duchess, and no one had seated me beside him, a clerk had. And so, in a manner of speaking, God had. It is a good thing to remember. It is what a house has, in place of luck. It is with that sentence that we take our leave of them, and of the house of Marlbrook, and of the Fen country, which is not, in the strict sense, any country you can find upon a map, but you may find its people, if you look, in any village where a woman mends her own sleeve at a window and does not weep. Remember only this, out of all that has been told, that the greatest hours of your life are prepared for you by hands that do not know they are preparing them, and are entered by doors you did not see, and that when the mistake is made at your table, the whole of your worth is in how you rise to keep or leave the seat. Kindness will find you out, and so will cruelty. Sit as you are, answer as you must. The rest is the world's business, and the world, in its slow way, keeps a fair book. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.